Why is Brahms's First Symphony sometimes called Beethoven's 10th?
In many ways, Johannes Brahms, 1833 to 1897, was the inheritor of Beethoven's genius, prompting some music historians to refer to Brahms's First Symphony as Beethoven's 10th. This is not to diminish the work of the great 19th-century composer, who left an enduring corpus of works. Brahms demonstrated that classicism continued to have artistic validity and was not incompatible with the Romanticism of the late 19th century.
What was the tariff of abominations?
In 1828 the U.S. Congress passed a bill putting high tariffs, government taxes, on imported goods. The measure was intended to protect the burgeoning industries of New England, where numerous factories had opened during the first 3 decades of the century, and the manufacture of finished goods defined the region's economy. Congress figured that by placing high taxes on goods from other countries, Americans would buy American-made products. But Southern farmers had come to rely on cheaper imported goods. Believing the 1828 legislation was overly protective of the nation's industrial interests, Southerners dubbed it the Tariff of Abominations. Vice President John C. Calhoun, 1782 to 1850, from South Carolina, openly and strongly criticized the tax, pronouncing that any state could declare null a federal law it deemed unconstitutional. In response, Congress took measures to lower the tariffs, but not eliminate them. South Carolina remained dissatisfied with the legislation, and in 1832 the state declared the Tariff Act null and void. Further, it threatened secession from the Union. President Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, unwilling to tolerate such rebelliousness, and determined to enforce the federal law at all costs, asked Congress to pass the force bill legislation allowing the nation's armed forces to collect the tariffs. Jackson's move inspired tremendous opposition in Congress. The Senate leader of the anti-Jackson contingency was Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, of Kentucky. Clay, who had earned himself the nickname Great Pacificator for his work in crafting the Missouri Compromise, 1820, presented another compromise in 1833. He proposed that duties on certain goods could remain high but others should be gradually reduced over time. The compromise tariff authored by Clay averted an all-out conflict in the nation. The measure was passed and thereafter tariffs were adjusted depending on the prevailing economic conditions. But the fury over the Tariff of Abominations further revealed the North-South differences and the federal government versus states' rights issues that would inspire the Southern states led by South Carolina to secede from the Union in 1860 and 1861, bringing on the American Civil War, 1861–65.
What was the Gang of Four?
The Gang of Four was a group within China's Communist Party that, under the leadership of Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, 1914–1991, 21 years his junior, carried out its own power-hungry agenda and plotted the takeover of the government from Chairman Mao, 1893–1976. A former stage and movie actress, Jiang was also an astute student of politics. In the late 1960s, at which time she had been married to Mao for some 30 years, she became associated with former army commander Lin Biao, and the pair conspired to stage a coup. In 1970, at a Communist Party conference, they announced that Lin had surpassed Mao as the leader of the people. 1 year later, Lin and Jiang tried to overthrow Mao's government. Failing, Lin fled the country. His plane was later shot down, and Jiang succeeded in covering up her involvement in the affair. But she continued her subversive activities, associating with 3 other members of the Politburo, the chief executive and political committee of the Communist Party. In 1974, Mao publicly admonished his wife and her cohorts, Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, and Zhang Chunqiu, to cease their power-seeking activities. Infighting in the party had already resulted in Mao's loss of influence. 2 years later, on September 9, 1976, Mao died. The Gang of Four were arrested and thrown into prison. There they remained for years while the case against them was formulated, resulting in an indictment that consisted of 20,000 words. Finally, on November 20, 1980, the Gang of Four expanded to include 6 other conspirators, were put on trial charged with counter-revolutionary acts, including sedition and conspiracy to overthrow the government, persecution of party and state leaders, suppression of the people, and plotting to assassinate Mao. During nearly 6 weeks of testimony, Jiang's machinations were revealed to the 600 representatives who attended the trial, held in an Air Force auditorium in western Beijing. As well as to the Chinese press, foreign press was prohibited from attending. Her laundry list of malicious acts as ringleader of the Gang of Four included public humiliation, and even torture of Communist Party rivals, execution of her personal enemies, inspiring the fear of the masses, and purging the arts of anything that did not carry a revolutionary theme. Jiang, while not denying many of these acts, insisted that she had all along acted at the behest of her husband, Mao. During the explosive testimony and presentation of evidence, which included tapes and documents substantiating the state's case against Jiang, she made outbursts, was temporarily expelled from the courtroom, was dragged screaming from the courtroom twice, and even taunted her accusers into executing her, saying it would be more glorious to have my head chopped off. In the end, Jiang and one other conspirator were found guilty and sentenced to death. later commuted to life in prison. And the 8 others were also found guilty and charged with sentences ranging from 16 years to life in prison. Zhang died on May 14, 1991, in what appeared to be a suicide.
What were the effects of the Dust Bowl?
After the dust had settled in the spring of 1934, the reaction among many great Plains farm families was to flee the devastation. More than 350,000 people packed up their belongings and headed west, their lives forever changed by the disaster. In his 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, American writer and Nobel laureate John Steinbeck (1902–1968) chronicled the harrowing and sorrowful westward journey of one Oklahoma family that was among the so-called Okies who deserted their farmlands. In the devastated area of the Great Plains in search of a better life elsewhere. Nature alone was not to blame for the Dust Bowl. By the end of the 19th century, farmers, aided by the advent of large tractors and reapers, harvesting machines, were cultivating the Great Plains. Uprooting the native buffalo grass, which holds moisture in the soil, keeping it from blowing away. Even strong winds and extended droughts had not disturbed the land when it was covered by the grassland. When the demand for wheat increased after World War I, 1914–18, farmers responded by planting more than 27 million new acres of the grain. By 1930 there were almost 3 times as many acres in wheat production as 10 years earlier. Most of the buffalo grass that had prevented the earth from blowing had been removed. When the next dry period came, in spring 1934, and the wind picked up, the Dust Bowl resulted. The government stepped in to remedy the problem. Soil conservation became the focus of federal agencies. And the U.S. Forest Service undertook a project to plant a shelter belt of trees within a 100-mile wide zone, from Canada to the Texas Panhandle. Recovery was aided by the return of the rains. Soon the buffalo grass had grown back, helping to ensure that the Dust Bowl would not recur.
Why is the court-martial of Billy Mitchell famous?
The 1925 military trial of William Billy Mitchell, 1879–1936, made headlines because of the defendant's open and controversial criticism of the U.S. military. A U.S. general in World War I, 1914–18, Mitchell returned from the experience convinced that the future military strength of the country depended on air power. In fact, he had commanded the American Expeditionary Air Force during the war in Europe and had even proposed to General John Pershing that troops be dropped by parachute behind German lines. Pershing dismissed the idea. The war over, in 1921 Mitchell declared that the first battles of any future war will be air battles. But when the Navy and War Departments failed to develop an air service, Mitchell was outspoken about it, charging the military with incompetence, criminal negligence, and describing the administration as treasonable. Those were fighting words. Charged with insubordination and conduct of a nature to bring discredit upon the military service. Mitchell's trial began on October 28, 1925. After lengthy hearings, on December 17 of that year Mitchell was found guilty and was suspended without pay from the military for a period of 5 years. Congress entered the fray, proposing a joint resolution to restore Mitchell's rank. But President Calvin Coolidge, 1872–1933, upheld the court's decision. Mitchell responded by resigning. He returned to civilian life but continued to write and speak about his belief in an air force. He died in 1936, about 5 years too soon to see his predictions come true. In surprise air raids on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked U.S. military installations in the Philippines and Hawaii, though the U.S. military rose to the occasion. Entering World War II and building an impressive and mighty air fleet, many observers felt the military could have been better prepared to stage that monumental effort had Mitchell's advice been heeded years earlier.
Who were the expansionists?
Not long after the colonies won the American Revolution, 1775–83, founding the United States of America. A nationalistic, super-patriotic spirit emerged in the hearts of many citizens of the new country. Eager to spread American ideals, many looked westward, northward, and southward to expand the territory of the Union beyond the original 13 states. These people were called expansionists. Not only did they favor the settlement of the frontier, but some advocated seizure of the Southwest. From Spain and later from Mexico, Florida, from Spain, the Louisiana Territory. From France, and the Northwest Territories and even Canada, from Britain. By the 1840s the doctrine of manifest destiny stating that the United States had a God-given right and duty to expand its territory and influence throughout North America took hold. The fires of expansionism were fanned by population growth during the 1800s. Pioneer settlement of the plains and the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, resulted in an increase in farmland and overall crop production. Yankee ingenuity resulted in inventions such as the cotton gin. 1793, and the McCormick Reaper, 1831, which improved the processing and harvesting of raw materials such as cotton and grain. And a continuous influx of immigrants from Europe supplied labor for the factories that had popped up across New England and the mid-Atlantic states. All these factors combined to create a rapid population growth. In the 2 decades between 1840 and 1860 alone, the population of the United States more than doubled, increasing from just over 17 million to more than 38 million. Though the eastern seaboard cities grew, a system of new canals, steamboats, roads, and railroads opened up the interior to increased settlement. By 1850 almost half the population lived outside the original 13 states. Though Canada, of course, remained in the hands of the British, the spirit of expansionism resulted. In the United States, relatively speedy acquisition of North American territories that had belonged to Spain. Mexico, France, and the British. By 1853 the United States owned all the territory of the present-day contiguous states. And by the end of the century, it owned all the territory of its present-day states including Alaska, purchased from Russia in 1867, and Hawaii, annexed in 1898.
When was Amelia Earhart last heard from?
American aviator Amelia Earhart, 1897 to 1937, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Was last seen on July 1, 1937, and was last heard from on July 2, as she and navigator Fred Noonan. 1893 to 1937, attempted to make an around-the-world flight along the equator. The Kansas-born Earhart first became interested in aviation, which was very new at the time, during the early 1920s, and began taking flying lessons. In 1928 she was invited to be the only woman on board a transatlantic flight, which departed from Newfoundland and landed in Wales. The trip made her famous as the first woman to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. She followed that accomplishment in 1932 with a solo transatlantic flight. Earhart took off from Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, Canada, on the evening of May 20, 1932. Her destination was Paris. Within hours problems began for the aviator. She encountered a violent electrical storm. The altimeter failed, the wings iced up, and finally, the exhaust manifold caught on fire. Earhart decided to land in Ireland rather than attempting Paris. After a 15-hour flight, she touched down in a pasture outside of Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Again, fame and acclaim were hers, as the first woman to cross the Atlantic in a solo flight. She went on to set speed and distance records for aviation and soon conceived of the idea of flying around the world along the equator. On May 20, 1937, Earhart and Noonan took off from Oakland, California. Reaching Miami, Florida, they stopped for repairs. On June 1, 1937, they departed Miami and headed for Brazil. From there, they flew across the Atlantic to Africa and then across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. Then it was on to Karachi, Pakistan, Calcutta, India, and Burma, present-day Myanmar. Earhart reached New Guinea on June 30, and she and Noonan prepared for the most difficult leg of the journey, to Howland Island. A tiny speck of land only 2.5 miles long in the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean. The next day, July 1, they left New Guinea and began the 2,600-mile flight to Howland Island. On July A U.S. Navy vessel picked up radio messages from Earhart that indicated reports of empty fuel tanks. Efforts to make radio contact with her failed, though an extensive search effort ensued. No trace of the plane or two-person crew was found, and no one knows for certain what happened. Speculation surrounds the disappearance. One theory was that Earhart's true mission in making the around the world flight was to spy on the Japanese-occupied Pacific Islands. However, this has never been substantiated, and, given the circumstances under which they were flying, the likelihood is that the plane crashed into the ocean, claiming Earhart's and Noonan's lives.
Who were the leaders of abolition?
Leaders of the anti-slavery movement included journalist William Lloyd Garrison, 1805 to 1879. Founder of the influential anti-slavery journal The Liberator and of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Established 1833, brothers Arthur, 1786 to 1865, and Lewis, 1788 to 1873, Tappan. Prominent New York merchants who were also founders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and Theodore Dwight Weld. 1803 to 1895, leader of student protests, organizer of the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, and author of the Bible Against Slavery, 1837, and other abolitionist works. Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman, c. 1820 to 1913, worked against slavery by helping to free hundreds of blacks who escaped slavery in the South. Heading for northern states and Canada. Writers such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811-1896, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1851-52. Helped strengthen the abolitionist cause and were instrumental in swaying public sentiment. In the hands of some activists, the movement became violent. In 1859, ardent abolitionist John Brown, 1800 to 1859, led a raid on the armory at Harper's Ferry, in present-day West Virginia, which proved a failed attempt to emancipate slaves by force.
What is the system of scientific management?
A system to gain maximum efficiency from workers and machinery, scientific management. Also known as Taylorism, was developed by American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, 1856 to 1915. As foreman in a steel plant, Taylor undertook time and motion studies and conducted experiments to determine the one best way to do any given job, developing detailed systems to yield the highest possible productivity levels. He first presented his theories in 1903 to the American Academy of Mechanical Engineers. Efficiency was the cornerstone of Taylorism. Production processes should not waste time or materials. He published his ideas in the landmark work The Principles of Management, 1911. and became a well-known engineering consultant, contracted by companies eager to maximize their output. The doctrine of scientific management was embraced by American industry. As transportation networks improved and the U.S. population grew rapidly in the early 1900s, markets expanded, placing great demands on industry. Applying Taylor's scientific management, manufacturers were able to boost productivity by as much as 200%. Since Taylorism broke production processes into individual tasks, each with its own best practice, new workers could be quickly and easily trained, which adherents believed was another benefit of the concept. Scientific management had many advocates, including engineers Frank, 1868 to 1924, and Lillian, 1878 to 1972, Gilbreth, who furthered Taylor's work, publishing volumes such as Primer of Scientific Management. 1911, Psychology of Management, 1912, and Studies on Motion, Fatigue, and Time. Among those who applied scientific management were Ford Motor Company, in developing the assembly line for the Model T. Boston retailer Fillings, one of the first commercial enterprises to use the method. And Bethlehem Steel, which conducted experiments in the loading of pig iron. Scientific management also had its detractors. Taylorism was criticized for having a dehumanizing effect on labor. In making every job routine, some charged that the system separated the minds of workers from their hands, eliminated the need for skilled workers, and gave management absolute control over production processes. Nevertheless, principles of scientific management remain evident in the workplace today. And the adoption of scientific management is credited with boosting American productivity and increasing stockholder profits. Theories concerning worker output were modified during the second half of the 20th century.
How old is Taoism?
It dates back to the 6th century B.C. when it was founded by Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, c. 550 BC. Master Lao, as he was known, believed in inaction and simplicity, which he combined with religious practices to form the mystical philosophy of the Tao, Dao, the path of virtuous conduct. Lao Tzu reasoned that since humans face a cloud of unknowability, they ought not to react to things at all. He viewed the world as a pendulum, with the Tao as its hinge. Anyone who struggles against the current of life is like an insect caught at the end of a pendulum, swinging back and forth, and suffering with each movement. But by crawling along the hinge, Tao, to reach the top, a place of complete stillness is found. Lao Tzu advised that people do away with their desires, avoiding that which is extreme, extravagant, or excessive, and steer clear of any competition. Many of these ideas are embodied in a work usually ascribed to him. Tao Te Ching, classic of the Way of Power. However, modern scholars now believe that tome to be the work of his followers. Taoism is still relevant to many today. When it was developed some 26 centuries ago, the philosophy filled a spiritual void that was not addressed by the practical doctrines of traditional Confucianism. One legend has it that Lao Tzu rebuked a young Confucius, 551 to 479 BC, for his pride. The Tao also contributed greatly to Buddhism, especially in its emphasis on meditation and sudden enlightenment. One of the great thinkers of the Chinese Taoist school was teacher and philosopher Chuang-Tzu, 4th century BC, who constructed a non-political, transcendental philosophy that promoted an individual's spiritual freedom. His self-titled work, Chuang-Tzu, is another classic of Dasein.
What was the Munich Pact?
It was a failed effort to appease the territory and power-hungry German leader Adolf Hitler. 1889 to 1945, in the days leading up to World War II, 1939 to 45. After Germany annexed neighboring Austria in the Anschluss of March 1938, it became known that Hitler had designs on the Sudetenland, a heavily German region of Czechoslovakia. With World War I, 1914-18, a fresh memory, and European nations still recovering from heavy losses, Europe's powers were eager to avoid another conflict. On September 29 and 30, 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler in Munich. They were joined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, a German ally, and French Premier Édouard Daladier, a Czech ally. Czechoslovakia did not have any representatives at the conference. The leaders quickly worked out a plan for Germany to occupy the Sudetenland. Chamberlain considered Czechoslovakia's concession a reasonable price to pay for peace on the continent. But the effort to assuage Hitler was not successful. In March 1939, Germany moved to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. On September 1, Germany marched into Poland, and World War II began.
Who invented the X-ray?
German physicist Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, 1845 to 1923, discovered X-rays in 1895 but did not understand at first what they were, which is how they got their name. In science and math, X refers to an unknown. By the end of the decade, hospitals had put X-rays to use, taking pictures called radiographs of bones and internal organs and tissues to help diagnose illnesses and injuries. Using the new technology, doctors could see the insides of a patient. In 1901, Röntgen received the first Nobel Prize in Physics for his discovery of a shortwave ray.
What happened on Iwo Jima?
During the month of February 1945, Allied forces and the Japanese fought for control of Iwo Jima. A small island in the northwest Pacific Ocean, 759 miles south of Tokyo. Japan was using Iwo Jima as a base from which to launch air attacks on U.S. bombers in the Pacific. Capturing the island from the Japanese became a key objective for the United States. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th U.S. Marine Divisions invaded the island. Fighting over the next several days claimed more than 6,000 U.S. troops. On the morning of February 23, after a rigorous climb to the top of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima's 550-foot inactive volcano, U.S. Marines planted an American flag. Though small, it was visible from around the island. Later that day, a larger flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi by 5 Marines and a Navy hospital corpsman. The moment was captured by American news photographer Joe Rosenthal. His famous photo became the inspiration for the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial, dedicated November 10, 1954, in Arlington, Virginia.
What was Nazism?
Short for National Socialism, Nazi was a derisive abbreviation that held. The Nazi doctrine rests on 3 philosophies: extreme nationalism, anti-Semitism, and anti-communism. As one of the Central Powers, Germany's defeat in World War I, 1914-18, resulted in severe punishment of that country and its seriously diminished role in Europe. The doctrines of Nazism took hold there, appealing to the masses with promises of a rebuilt Germany. The Bible of Nazism was Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle, 1923, which asserted the superiority of a pure Aryan race. Aryans are non-Jewish Caucasians, particularly those of Northern European descent. Led by an infallible ruler, called the Führer, the re-establishment of a German empire, the Third Reich, and the systematic annihilation of people who Nazis perceived to be Germany's worst enemies, Jews and Communists. Nazis ruled Germany from 1933. When Hitler rose to power as head of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. In their own country, they enforced their policies through a secret police. The Gestapo, stormtroops, called the SS, and Hitler's bodyguard, called the SA. Elsewhere in Europe, the Nazis used sheer force in imposing their system. Their aggression and ruthlessness resulted in World War II, 1939-45. During the Holocaust, 1933-45, Nazi soldiers, led by Hitler's henchmen, persecuted and exterminated upwards of 12 million people, at least half of whom were European Jews. Nazism ended in 1945, when Hitler killed himself and Germany lost the war. The doctrine, which demonstrated how detrimentally powerful a theory can be, was outlawed thereafter. Sadly, the late 20th century saw a resurgence of neo-Nazism among extremists in Germany and the United States.
What are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse?
The four horsemen of the Apocalypse are allegorical figures mentioned in chapter 6 of Revelation. Also called the Revelation of St. John the Divine. The chapter describes a scroll which contains 7 seals and is held in God's right hand. When the first 4 of the seals are opened, the 4 horsemen appear, each on a different colored horse. There are various interpretations of these allegorical figures, but the rider on the white horse is believed to represent conquest, or the return of Christ. The rider on the red horse is believed to represent war. The rider on the black horse, famine, and the pale horse, death. Some believe these hardships to be signs of the end of the world. The symbol of the 4 horsemen has appeared throughout art and literature.
How long was it before someone reached the east by sailing west?
It was not until 1520 that a route was found. Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, c. 1480 to 1521, was on an expedition for Spain when he found a southwest passage, which took him around the southern tip of South America, through a winding waterway that still bears his name, the Strait of Magellan. Having set out from Spain in September 1519, it was a full year later before Magellan, born Fernando de Magalhães, and known in Spain as Fernando de Magallanes, reached this point. South of the South American mainland and north of the Tierra del Fuego island chain, today these islands are part of Argentina and Chile. And this was only after he had crushed a mutiny. Nevertheless, Magellan had found a connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. He sailed on from there, reaching the island we know as Guam on March 6, 1521. 10 days later, he discovered the Philippines. On the Philippine island of Cebu, he made an alliance with a treacherous native sovereign for whom he undertook an expedition to the nearby island of Mactan. It was there that Magellan met with his death in April 1521. His expedition continued without him. Under the direction of Juan Sebastián de Elcano, c. 1476 to 1526, who in 1522 returned to Seville, Spain. Along with 18 other survivors of the Magellan expedition. Their cargo, aboard the ship Victoria, included valuable spices which more than paid for the expense of the expedition.
Mitchell later said that as he sat thinking about the tragic news, he wondered to himself, "Here I am running around the world doing all these things, why not do them at home?"
Mitchell had spent his youth in Harlem, and he felt he should return there to establish a school to pass on his knowledge to others and to give black dancers the opportunity to perform. The primary purpose of the school was to promote interest in and teach young black people the art of classical ballet, modern and ethnic dance. thereby creating a much-needed self-awareness and better self-image of the students themselves. The idea was a success. During the 1970s and 1980s the company toured nationally and internationally, often performing to sell-out crowds and participating in prestigious events including international art festivals, a state dinner at the White House, and the closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympic Games. Today, the Dance Theater of Harlem is acknowledged as one of the world's finest ballet companies. Not only did Mitchell succeed in giving black dancers the opportunity to learn and to perform, he effectively erased color barriers in the world of dance, testimony to the universality of classical ballet.
How old is the AFL-CIO?
The roots of the American Federation of Labor Congress of Industrial Organizations. AFL-CIO, today a federation of national unions. Date to 1881 when the Federation of Organized Trade and Labor Unions was formed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, by trade union leaders representing some 50,000 members in the United States and Canada. Reorganizing in 1886, the Association of Unions changed its name to the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and elected Samuel Gompers, 1850 to 1924, president. Unlike the open membership policy of the Knights of Labor, from whom the AFL gained numerous members in 1886, the AFL determined to organize by craft. At the outset, its member unions included a total of 140,000 skilled laborers. Gompers, who immigrated from England in 1863 and became the first registered member of the Cigar Makers International Union in 1864, had been active in labor for more than 2 decades. Once chosen as president of the AFL, Gompers remained in that office, with the exception of only 1 year, until his death in 1924. During the nearly 40-year period, he shaped the Labor Federation and helped it make strides by determining a general policy that allowed member unions autonomy. Unlike the Knights of Labor, which pursued long-term goals such as Knights leader Terence Powderly's abstract objective of making every man his own master, every man his own employer, the AFL focused its efforts on specific, short-term goals such as higher wages, shorter hours, and the right to bargain collectively, when an employer agrees to negotiate with worker/union representatives. In the 1890s the AFL was weakened by labor violence, which evoked public fears. A July 1892 strike at the Carnegie Steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, turned into a riot between angry steel workers and Pinkerton guards. The militia was called in to monitor the strike, which 5 months later ended in failure for the AFL-affiliated steel workers. Nevertheless, under Gompers's leadership, membership of the AFL grew to more than 1 million by 1901 and to 2.5 million by 1917, when it included 111 national unions and 27,000 local unions. The Federation collected dues from its members, creating a fund to aid striking workers. The organization avoided party politics, instead seeking out and supporting advocates regardless of political affiliation. The AFL worked to support the establishment of the U.S. Department of Labor, 1913, which administers and enforces statutes promoting the welfare and advancement of the American workforce, and the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, 1914, which strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, eventually delivering a blow to monopolies. The CIO was founded in 1938. In the early 1930s, several AFL unions banded together as the Committee for Industrial Organization and successfully conducted campaigns to sign up new members in mass production facilities such as the automobile, steel, and rubber industries. Since these initiatives, which resulted in millions of new members, were against the AFL policy of signing up only skilled laborers by craft, the CIO had reached out to all industrial workers, regardless of skill level or craft. A schism resulted within the AFL. The unions that had participated in the CIO membership drive were expelled from the AFL. The CIO established itself as a federation in 1938, officially changing its name to the Congress of Industrial Organizations. In 1955, amidst a climate of increasing anti-unionism, the AFL and CIO rejoined to form one strong voice. Today the organization has craft and industrial affiliates at the international, national, state, and local levels, with membership totaling in the millions.
When did the Napoleonic Wars begin and end?
The Napoleonic Wars began shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, took power and lasted until 1815. When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Ever the general, Napoleon used his power to keep France at war throughout his reign. After the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire, November 1799, which had put Napoleon in power. At first he effected peace. In May 1800 he marched across the Alps to defeat the Austrians, ending the war with them that had begun 8 years earlier. Britain, fearing a growing European power on the continent, had declared war on France in 1793, by 1802, having grown tired of battle. The country agreed to peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Amiens. But the calm in Europe was not to last. By 1803 the diminutive but power-hungry Napoleon, nicknamed the Little Corporal, had begun to plot an invasion of Britain. Declaring himself emperor in 1804, he initiated a series of campaigns across Europe. And by 1806 most of the continent was under his control. He remained, of course, unable to beat the British, whose superior navy gave them supremacy at sea. But the various alliances, called coalitions, formed by European countries against Napoleon eventually broke him. After he had been defeated in Russia in 1812, the European powers that had long been held in submission by Napoleon formed a sixth and final coalition against him: Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, Prussia and Austria met Napoleon's army at the momentous Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Poland. From October 16 to 19, 1813, Napoleon was defeated there in what is sometimes called the War of Liberation, and he retreated to France. The following March, the Allies making up the Sixth Coalition took Paris. Napoleon's generals were defeated. He abdicated the throne on April 6. However, that was not the end of the Napoleonic era. Exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. Believing he could recover power in the unstable atmosphere that followed his abdication. 3 months later he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars. He was exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died in 1821.
Who was Clara Barton?
The American humanitarian was called the Angel of the Battlefield for her work during the Civil War, 1861–65. Clara, Clarissa Harlow, Barton. 1821–1912, was a nurse in army camps and on battlefields, where she cared for the wounded. When the fighting ended, Barton formed a bureau to search for missing men. This demanding work left her exhausted. Recuperating in Switzerland in 1869, Barton learned of the newly formed International Red Cross, established 1863. She rallied to the aid of that volunteer organization, tending the needs of those wounded in the fighting of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, which German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck 1815–1898, had provoked in his attempt to create a unified German Empire. In 1877 Barton began working to form the American Red Cross. Her efforts came to fruition in 1881 with the establishment of the first U.S. branch of the International Red Cross. She became the organization's first president, a post she held from 1882 to 1904. When Johnstown, Pennsylvania, experienced a devastating flood in 1889, Barton took charge of relief work there. She subsequently advocated a clause be added to the Red Cross Constitution, stating that the organization would also provide relief during calamities other than war. She was successful. It is because of Barton that the Red Cross has become a familiar and welcome sight in times of disaster.
What were the Jim Crow laws?
They were laws or practices that segregated blacks from whites. They prevailed in the American South during the late 1800s and into the first half of the 1900s. Jim Crow was a stereotype of a black man described in a 19th-century song and dance act. The first written appearance of the term is dated 1838. And by the 1880s it had fallen into common usage in the United States. Even though in 1868 Congress passed the 14th Amendment, prohibiting states from violating equal protection of all citizens. Southern states passed many laws segregating blacks from whites in public places. In short, the laws were both manifestation and enforcement of discrimination. Thanks to the civil rights movement, the laws were finally found to be unconstitutional during the 1950s and 1960s.
What was the Long March?
The Long March began in October 1934 when Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976, led Chinese Communist forces. The Red Army of China, numbering 100,000 men and women, on an epic walk across China, with the Nationalist Army in pursuit. The Communist marchers crossed 18 mountain chains and 24 rivers to cover 6,000 miles. Almost all women and children died along the way. In 1935, 20,000 to 30,000 people finally reached Shaanxi, Shenzi, province in the north, where the Red Army established a stronghold. It was there that Mao, one of the earliest members of the Chinese Communist Party, formulated his own philosophy that came to be known as Maoism. He had adapted Marxism to the Chinese conditions, replacing German politician and socialist Karl Marx's 1818 to 1883, urban working class with the peasant farmers as the force behind revolution. The Red Army went on to defeat the Nationalists in 1949. Mao was named chairman of the People's Republic of China, a communist state, that same year.
When did IBM enter the personal computer business?
IBM, International Business Machines, organized in 1924, had long been an industry leader in developing and producing computers for business and science, but in August 1981, the company jumped into the consumer business, competing with upstart Apple for a share in the personal computer, PC, business. The PC introduced by IBM used a Microsoft Disk operating system, MS-DOS, and soon captured 75% of the market. Observing the company's enormous success, other firms began producing IBM clones, which could use the same software as the IBM PC.
What caused the Reformation?
The religious movement during the 16th century also had political and cultural causes. As more and more people were converted to Christianity during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, the Pope's sphere of influence gradually increased, giving him greater authority than many secular rulers. This supremacy was defended by Pope Innocent III, c. 1160 to 1216, one of the most prominent figures of the Middle Ages, who asserted that the Church should rightly retain its full power in both secular and spiritual matters. But in Western Europe, the monarchs became increasingly powerful as peasants began moving away from their farms and villages and to the emerging cities, which were protected by kings and emperors. The European monarchs often opposed the Pope, regarding him as a leader of a foreign state. This conflict continued for centuries. In 1309 Pope Clement V, c. 1260 to 1314, did something that would later divide the Roman Catholic Church when, being French himself, he moved the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, where it stayed for 70 years. When Pope Gregory XI, 1329 to 1378, moved it back to Rome in 1377, some French cardinals objected and elected a pope of their own, an anti-pope, installing him at Avignon. This resulted in two popes claiming supremacy. And in 1409 the situation grew more complicated when a third pope was added in Pisa, Italy. Not only had the power struggle divided the Church, it had created tremendous confusion for the people, who further perceived that there were corrupt practices at work in the Church. These included the selling of church positions and indulgences, pardons for sins, as well as the lavish lifestyle enjoyed by the bishops and the Pope, which was on a par with that of royalty. While these injustices were decried by critics, the abuses did not stop. As a remedy, some began to think that the Church should be led not by the Pope but by church councils. Dissatisfaction with the Church also extended to its message, which had turned away from God's mercy and the teachings of Jesus Christ, instead focusing on a life of good works as the way to salvation. Europe was also in the midst of the Renaissance, 1350 to 1600, which saw a proliferation in the number of universities, the circulation of printed materials, thanks to the advent of the movable type printing press, and broader study of classic texts as well as of the Holy Scriptures in their original languages instead of how they had been handed down in translation by the Church. Before long, a middle class of educated people emerged in Europe. These circumstances combined to bring about a period of religious reform that lasted until 1648. The movement itself, however, continued to exert influence through its emphasis on personal responsibility, individual freedom, and the secularization of society.
What was Lend-Lease?
Lend-Lease was a plan, developed and strongly supported by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, to extend material assistance to the Allied powers fighting the Axis powers in World War II. 1939 to 45, in the days preceding U.S. involvement in the war, Roosevelt argued that it was imperative for the country to come to the aid of those fighting Germany and Italy. It was similar to helping your neighbor put out a fire in his house in order to prevent your own house from catching fire and burning. Under Lend-Lease, which was passed by Congress on March 11, 1941, approximately $50 billion of aid in the form of food and supplies, weapons, machinery, and other equipment was provided to the Allied nations, primarily to Britain and the Commonwealth nations first, but later to all nations fighting against Hitler's war machine. The return of the goods was not addressed until after the war had ended. At that time, most people felt the Allies had all contributed everything they had to the war effort, and that the sacrifices made by Allied Europe in the days prior to U.S. entry into the fighting were balanced by the contributions made under the Lend-Lease Act.
Is there an American poet laureate?
Yes, in 1985 the U.S. Congress authorized the naming of a national poet laureate. In 1986, Kentucky-born man of letters Robert Penn Warren, 1909 to 1989, became the country's first poet laureate. Among his works are the novels All the King's Men, 1946, Pulitzer Prize, and A Place to Come To, 1977, several volumes of poetry, and essays published in the anthology I'll Take My Stand, 1930. He was also the editor, 1935-42, of the literary journal The Southern Review. Warren's successors have included Joseph Brodsky, Mona Van Dyne, the first woman to receive the honor, and Rita Dove, the first African American to receive the honor. The complete list of poet laureates is available on the Library of Congress's website. http://www.loc.gov/poetry/laureate.html.
What impact have VCRs and digital recorders had on television viewing?
Since VCRs, invented 1975, and the more recent digital recorders such as TiVo give viewers the ability to record television programs and watch them when they choose, a phenomenon known as time shifting has emerged. As Americans watch previously recorded programming, they miss primetime broadcasts. Commentators mused that Americans were losing a sense of community. Gone were the days when office workers would stand around a water cooler to chat about last night's episode of a popular program. Since these recording devices also gave viewers the ability to fast forward through commercials, a practice dubbed zapping, they posed challenges to the advertising industry.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also called the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments appear in the Bible in the book of Exodus 20:2-17, and in the book of Deuteronomy 5:6-21. They are considered the summary of divine law as handed down by God to Moses. who not only heard them but received them in the form of writing on 2 stone tablets as he stood atop Mount Sinai, what is known today as Gebel Musa. On Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, where he had been summoned by God. According to the Bible, the commandments, which are paramount in the ethical systems of Judaism and Christianity, are these: 1. Do not have any other God besides the Lord God. 2. Do not have or worship idols. Carved images. 3. Do not make wrong use of the name of the Lord your God, or do not take the name of the Lord in vain. 4. Keep the Sabbath day holy. 5. Honor your mother and your father. 6. Do not commit murder. 7. Do not commit adultery. 8. Do not steal. 9. Do not give false evidence against your neighbor. And 10. Do not covet your neighbor's household or lust after your neighbor's spouse.
Why was the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory important to the labor movement?
The March 25, 1911, blaze, which killed 146 people, most of them women, prompted public outrage and led to the immediate passage of fire safety legislation and became a rallying cry for labor reforms. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan office building. It was one of the most successful garment factories in New York City, employing some 1,000 workers, mostly immigrant women. But the conditions were hazardous, the space was cramped, accessible only via stairwells and hallways so narrow that people had to pass single file. Only one of the 4 elevators was regularly in service. The cutting machines in the workroom were gas-powered, scraps of fabric littered the work areas, the water barrels, for use in case of fire, were not kept full, and the no smoking rule was not strictly enforced. In short, it was an accident waiting to happen. When the fire broke out on a weekend, the cause is unknown since the building was charred so badly. About half of the employees were there. Smoke and fire, however, were not the only causes of death in the panicked escape. People were trampled, fell in elevator shafts, jumped several stories to the pavement below, and were killed when a fire escape melted and collapsed. While the fire happened during a time of labor reform, those reforms had not come soon enough to save the lives of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory employees, who had been subjected to extremely poor and dangerous working conditions. The disaster became a rallying cry for the labor movement. Tens of thousands of people marched in New York City in tribute to those who had died, calling attention to the grave social problems of the day. In New York State, the fire safety reforms for factories came right away. The legislature appointed investigative commissions to examine factories statewide, and 30 ordinances in New York City were enacted to enforce fire prevention measures. One of the earliest was the Sullivan-Hoye Fire Prevention Law of October 1911, which combined 6 agencies to form an efficient fire commission. Soon factories were required to install sprinkler systems. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became an object lesson for the entire nation, prompting the consolidation of reform efforts. The much-needed labor reforms, which addressed the miserable working conditions, did not come until years later.
What happened to the Butcher of Bosnia?
During the Bosnian War, Radovan Karadzic, 1945, the former president of the Serb Republic and commander of its armed forces, earned himself the ignominious nickname the Butcher of Bosnia for directing the massacres and mass victimization of enemies, many of them Muslims. Following the war, the United Nations International Court Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague issued 2 indictments of Karadzic, charging him with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Karadzic disappeared in 1996 and was still at large in spring 2005. There were warrants for his arrest. In early December 1998, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, forces arrested Karadzic henchman General Major Radislav Kristic, 1948. The high-ranking Serbian official was believed to have taken part in the July 1995 massacre of as many as 8,000 Muslims in the eastern Bosnian town of Srebrenica. On August 2, 2001, Kristic was found guilty of genocide, persecutions for murders, cruel and inhumane treatment, terrorizing the civilian population, forcible transfer and destruction of personal property of Bosnian Muslim civilians, and murder as a violation of the laws and customs of war. He was sentenced to 46 years in prison. After appeals, in April 2004, Kristic's sentence was reduced to 35 years based on the court's belief that he had aided and abetted acts of genocide but had not instigated them. He was transferred to Great Britain to serve out his sentence. Another high-ranking Serbian military leader who faced charges of genocide before the ICTY was General Ratko Mladic, 1942. As the former commander of the Bosnian Serb forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mladic was considered responsible for the serious breaches of international humanitarian law committed by the Bosnian Serb forces between May 1992 and July 1995, including the massacre at Srebrenica. His indictment also included charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was still wanted in spring 2005.